20 million barrels a day, gone. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most important energy choke point on Earth, is effectively closed right now. 14 commercial vessels were attacked. 7 seafarers are dead. Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, the 3 largest shippers in the world, have pulled out entirely. And while the rest of the world scrambles, while South Korea caps fuel prices for the first time in 30 years, while Japan prepares to crack open one of the largest emergency oil reserves on the planet, one country is still getting its oil delivered. China. Not through some alternative pipeline, not through some clever rerouting, through the Strait of Hormuz itself, the same waterway that Iran declared closed to everyone else. Here's the part that should alarm you. Since the war began on February 28th, Iran has shipped at least 11.7 million barrels of crude oil directly to China through the supposedly closed strait on dark fleet tankers that answer to no one. And the deal that made this possible was signed in public, and almost nobody in the West paid attention. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. On January 29th of this year, Iran, China, and Russia signed a trilateral strategic pact. Simultaneous ceremonies in Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow. The agreement covers diplomatic coordination, economic resilience, military cooperation, and the accelerated development of alternative financial systems designed specifically to bypass Western banking. This was not a handshake. This was an architecture. But the foundation was laid years earlier. On March 27, 2021, China and Iran signed what they called a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. A leaked draft reported by Petroleum Economist described $400 billion in Chinese investment, $280 billion for energy, $120 billion for infrastructure, and a guaranteed oil discount, 12% below the benchmark, plus an additional 6 to 8% on top of that. Now, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called it a general framework. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission said the $400 billion figure was, and I quote, highly unrealistic. Cumulative Chinese investment in Iran over the prior 15 years totaled only about $27 billion. But here is what that assessment missed. China did not need to invest $400 billion. China needed a pipeline of cheap oil and a financial system to pay for it that Washington could not touch. And that is exactly what they built. Let me give you the numbers. China buys over 80% of Iran's total crude exports. Some analysts put it at 90%. In 2025, China imported an average of 1.38 million barrels per day of Iranian crude. That is 13.4% of China's total seaborne oil imports. In February 2026, the month before the war began, purchases surged to 2.16 million barrels per day, the highest level since July 2018. Beijing was stockpiling. The discount has widened dramatically, from roughly $3 per barrel below Brent in early 2025 to $8 to $11 per barrel below Brent by early 2026. China is buying sanctioned oil at a massive markdown, while the rest of the world pays full price. And the infrastructure to make this work is extraordinary. Shadow tankers made over 1,500 trips from Iran to China in 2025 alone. Iranian crude gets relabeled as Malaysian or Indonesian. Here's how you know it is fake. China imports 1.3 million barrels per day of so-called Malaysian crude. Malaysia only produces 535,000 barrels per day total. The math does not work. It was never supposed to. A Wall Street Journal investigation uncovered an oil for infrastructure system channeling an estimated $8.4 billion through opaque financial entities in 2024 alone. Payments also flow through yuan-denominated transactions, through barter arrangements. Chinese car kits exchanged for Iranian copper and zinc. The Trump administration sanctioned Chinese teapot refineries for the first time. Shandong Shouguang Luqing Petrochemical in March 2025, Shandong Shenxing Chemical in April 2025. A third-round hit in May 2025. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies assessed that volumes were holding steady at around 1.6 million barrels per day. 3 rounds of sanctions. 0 reduction in flow. The sanctions did not work. Now here is where it gets dark. When the IRGC declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on March 1st, they did not build a traditional naval blockade. They did something smarter. They used the Houthi Red Sea model, scaled up dramatically, selective drone strikes on commercial vessels. Not enough to sink every ship, just enough to make the strait commercially uninsurable. Think about that for a second. No insurance means no shipping company will send a vessel. No shipping means the strait is functionally closed. Not by mines, not by warships, by spreadsheets, by risk calculations, by insurance underwriters in London who decided the math did not work. But Iran's own tankers, the Dark Fleet, were never insured by Western companies in the first place. They have nothing to lose. So while 150 commercial ships sit stranded outside the strait, while Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq cannot export a single barrel to their customers, Iranian crude flows directly to Chinese ports on vessels that no insurance company covers and no Western authority tracks. Let me put that in perspective. 20% of the world's oil normally flows through this choke point. 20% of global LNG. The top exporters through the strait are Saudi Arabia at 37.2%, Iraq at 22.8%, UAE at 12.9%, Iran at 10.6%, and Kuwait at 10.1%. 84 to 89% of that oil goes to Asia. China alone receives 37.7%. The bypass infrastructure is grossly insufficient. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline handles about 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline adds another 2 million barrels per day. Together, 7 million barrels per day. The strait normally carries 20 million barrels per day. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain have no pipeline bypass at all. None. Iran closed the door on its own neighbors and left it open for its best customer. The consequences are cascading across the globe right now. Brent crude sat at $68 to $72 before the war. On March 9th, it hit $119.50. The largest weekly gain in futures history, 35.6%. WTI posted similar gains. European natural gas prices have doubled since the conflict began. Qatar declared force majeure on all gas contracts on March 4th after Iranian strikes hit its production facilities. Combined Gulf production cuts now total roughly 6.7 million barrels per day. That is 6% of global supply simply offline. Yesterday, March 11th, the IEA announced its largest coordinated oil reserve release in its 52-year history, 400 million barrels, more than double what they released after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. 32 member countries participating. 400 million barrels sounds enormous, but let me give you the math. Global oil consumption runs about 100 million barrels a day. 400 million barrels is 4 days of global supply. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20 million barrels a day. 400 million barrels covers 20 days of strait flows. Macquarie analysts put it bluntly, if that does not sound like much, it is not. If the strait stays closed past April, the reserves run dry. Strait. South Korea is already in crisis mode. Fuel price caps have been imposed for the first time in 30 years. An emergency 6 million barrel crude purchase was secured from the UAE. A potential ban on oil product exports is under consideration. South Korea gets 70% of its crude from the Middle East, and 68% of those imports transit the Strait of Hormuz directly. Its natural gas reserves sit above the 9-day legal minimum, but the government has declined to say by how much. Japan is next. 95% of Japan's crude oil imports come from the Middle East. That is the highest share since 1965. 70% of Japan's oil transits the strait. Japanese refiners are urgently pressing the government to release strategic reserves. Japan holds roughly 260 million barrels in government stockpiles. enough for about 146 days. Private sector stocks add another 101 days. But at current consumption rates, with no Middle Eastern supply, those reserves start looking finite very quickly. Japan. Here is the uncomfortable truth about the United States. The US is the world's largest oil producer, 13.6 million barrels per day in 2025, a record. The US has been a net energy exporter since 2019. American LNG export capacity stands at 15.4 billion cubic feet per day, and it is growing fast. Plaquemines, LNG, Corpus Christi, Stage 3, Golden Pass, all coming online. With Qatar's gas offline, American LNG fills a critical gap. ExxonMobil is trading near its all-time high at roughly $155. Chevron just hit a 52-week high at about $197. Their Permian Basin break-even costs around $35 to $62 per barrel. At current Brent prices above $90, every additional dollar flows straight to the bottom line. One industry estimate puts the windfall at $20 billion in additional weekly profit for U.S. energy companies if Qatari gas stays offline through the summer. But here's what the producers will not tell you. Oil is a globally priced commodity. American gasoline has already jumped 51 cents in a single week to $3.45 a gallon. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve sits at roughly 415 million barrels, only 58% of capacity. It was supposed to be refilled. Trump pledged to fill it to the top. A year later, it is still less than 60% full, and now oil is above $100. Reserve. Goldman Sachs projects Brent could reach $147 per barrel, surpassing the 2008 peak if the war continues through March. Standard Chartered warns of 140 to 150. Morgan Stanley says expect higher energy prices, hotter inflation, and greater market uncertainty. RBC Capital Markets summarized it this way: we are now facing what looks like the biggest energy crisis since the 1973 oil embargo. There are only two scenarios right now. Scenario 1. The U.S. Navy clears the strait. They have already destroyed 16 Iranian mine layers. Iran is estimated to hold up to 6,000 naval mines, but its launch capacity is degrading under sustained strikes. If the strait reopens within 4 to 6 weeks, oil falls back to the $80 to $90 a barrel range. The reserves hold. Supply chains restart. The crisis becomes a sharp but temporary shock. Scenario 2. The strait stays closed into May and beyond. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE remain locked out of global markets. They cannot export. They are running out of storage. The 400 million barrel reserve release buys 3 weeks, maybe 4. After that, rationing in South Korea, in Japan, in India, potentially in Europe. Oil hits $150 a barrel, maybe $200. The IRGC warned of exactly that number. And China? Sitting on 155 million barrels of Iranian crude in floating storage offshore, plus continued dark fleet deliveries at an $8 to $11 per barrel discount, rides it out with the cheapest energy supply on Earth. In scenario 2, the country that helped Iran build this system, the country that funded its economy through sanctions, the country that signed the pact in January, becomes the last major economy with secure, affordable energy. Not because they found a better technology, not because they planned better, because they made a deal that the rest of the world refused to take seriously. 20 million barrels a day used to flow through the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, it is down to a trickle of dark fleet tankers flying no flag, carrying Iranian crude, bound for Chinese ports. The IRGC commander said not 1 liter of oil would get through. He was almost right. Almost. They left the door open for exactly one country. What happens in the next 72 hours as the IEA reserve release hits the market, as oil futures open, as the Pentagon assesses mine clearance operations in the Strait, could determine the shape of global energy markets for the next decade. The deal was signed in public. The oil is flowing in the dark. And the world is only now starting to understand what that means.